following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. For more information, please visit our website at www.dallasgenealogy.org. Welcome. My name is Tony Hansen. This is the Technology Special Interest Group, and we're meeting on Thursday, February 5th at the Dallas Public Library, just for the purposes of the recording. And we're here to talk tonight about understanding your smartphone. And so there's a lot of information to go over. There's a lot to know about phones and about the way that they work that I hope you'll find as interesting as I do. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. For those of you that don't know my background, I worked for AT&T for about 32 years in the Network Operations Department. In the last part of my career, I actually worked in the group that provisioned equipment that we were placing out in the cell towers, building out the network for some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to try not to have my AT&T retiree bias hat on. If I sound too bias, call me on it and just tell me to shut up, but I'll try not to do that. There's some impressive numbers out there about cell phones, about smartphones. Right now, at the present time, there are about 1.75 billion smartphones out there around the world. 1 out of every 5 person on the planet have one. So, you know, if you have one, you think, ooh, I'm pretty special. You're in a lot of company. A lot of us have them, and a lot more are getting them. Even tablets, where, you know, there's kind of a blur between what is a smartphone and what is a tablet. There's an awful lot of those out there as well. So they're everywhere, and they're spreading like wildfire, and there's a lot of good reasons for it. They're pretty fascinating things. In the United States, you know, we've had the luxury of having a really good telephone network for quite a long time. And so in the United States, we've largely been focused on landlines and things that have been kind of in the house. The rest of the world, not so much. In the world that has been developing and hasn't been on the technology stream like we are, they started out with wireless stuff because it's a very easy network to build out. You just build a few towers and bam, you're a telephone company. And so for the rest of the world, many people, many countries are actually started or have started their telephone infrastructure on the wireless. They never really had the wired thing that we have here. And so as a result, what's going on in the rest of the world, and sometimes, in some cases, is a little more exciting, a little more faster paced than what is going on in the United States. There's a lot of activity and a lot of things happening in the world around wireless technology because that's all they have and that's all that they've ever had and that's all they've ever known. So, you know, most of the rest of the world kind of skipped the wired stuff and went right into the wireless. And as a result, there's many apps and many services for these, you know, billions of cell phones out there that have been designed specifically and exclusively for the cell phone. People are developing applications and people are using them that have never used a landline telephone before. The smartphone's the only thing they've ever known. And these applications are very targeted and very focused on that very mobile and very connected segment of the population. And so it's made some really interesting things happen, and it's going to make for really interesting times as this technology continues to accelerate and continues to get, you know, more and more deployed and more used. So I'm going to start, hopefully I'm not going to bore you too much. I'm going to give you a little bit of an explanation of how the telephone network works and how the cell phone kind of ties into that network, because it's kind of helpful to understand, because in this country we're very consumed on this transition towards a wireless network. As we'll talk about later on, the big companies, Verizon and AT&T, are trying to get all of us away from these old landline phones that we've all grown up with and know and love, and move into the newer things that are going in the wireless world. And so a lot of what I'm describing to you, AT&T and Verizon would very much love to rip out and throw away and forget that they ever invented, because they don't want to do that anymore. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So this, very simplistically, is, you know, what the telephone used to be for all of us. And the little blue things down there are the telephones. You had physically wires attached it into a local office someplace. Could be up to several miles away from the house. And if you were calling your neighbor, you'd pick up the phone, you'd dial into the switch would figure out who you're dialing, would make the phone in the house ring, and you'd have a connection, you'd have a conversation. So that's kind of the very simplest kind of a phone call you could have, which was a local call. The network is kind of a hierarchy thing, so they have these things that were called tandem switches. And so if you were calling somebody a little bit further away, your call might get routed through the tandem switch and then over to a second local switch, but the idea is still the same. You pick it up, get dial tone, dial the number, it gets routed through the tandem switch, back over to the local switch, and you're calling somebody a little bit further away from you. In this case, then there'd be a couple of central offices involved. If you're calling, remember toll calls? long distance, things like that. That's where the offices are even further apart. You might have a pair or actually several tandem switches involved in stringing the calls together and establishing the connection from one end to the other. So now when the cellular network got introduced back in the 1960s, they introduced something called a mobile telephone switching office, or MITSO. And it's connected into the landline telephone network, but then it has some cable or some fiber going over to a cellular tower, and that tower actually broadcasts a radio signal that goes down, and these are our cute little mobile telephones, telephones on wheels. I did that one. So you actually have a wireless link between the cellular telephone and the cell tower. And so everything that is going on between that phone and the network is happening over a radio link. And so there's a transmitter and a receiver on the phone, transmitter and receiver up in the tower. You have a connection. And then from there, the information got hauled back to the mobile telephone switching office, possibly through a tandem switch, and that's how a mobile caller could call somebody on a landline and vice versa. So, with mobile telephones, a lot more equipment got introduced into the telephone network, and a lot of effort went into squeezing all of the performance that they could possibly get on that radio link between your cell phone and the tower. Because towers are expensive, and they wanted to get as many people on there as they possibly can. Now, when you're driving around, they're mobile phones, so they have wheels, so you can move them. And what happens as you're moving around on a cellular phone, you will eventually get to a point where you're out of range of one tower and in range with the other tower. And what will happen then as you move is that the telephone network will perform what's called a handoff. And so you'll stop talking to that tower on the left over there, and now your radio link is carried by the tower over here on the right. And there are towers all around the country now, and as you move from place to place, the network, hopefully seamlessly from the carrier's perspective, will transfer your call automatically from one cell tower to the next to the next. Now, we've all experienced dropped calls. So, you may have gone from a tower that had plenty of capacity and moved to a place where there was no more capacity. There was no circuits left on that tower. Sorry, we just dropped your call. We'll try it again. And some other things too. But the idea is as the network gets more crowded, you have to build more cell towers because you keep taking the number of the area and making it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The trend today is in things called microcells. They're actually mounting little devices inside of buildings and in densely populated neighborhoods. Things like AT&T Stadium, where the Cowboys play, where you have 100,000 people. Lots and lots of little mini cells in there. So they keep making them smaller and smaller because they have to handle lots and lots of calls where there's lots and lots of cell phones. So, kind of where we are today is we have this integrated network where cell phones, cell towers are integrated and tied into the telephone network, and it all works pretty well. But it's also pretty much working along the lines of the technology that phones have always used. Yes, there is a radio link between the phone and the towers, but for the most part, the types of circuits that are tying this all together are the traditional voice circuits that have been in the telephone network for 50, 75, 100 years. And that's in the process of being changed quite radically, because it turns out that's a very inefficient way to handle data, which more and more is what we're all using, and very expensive to carry data over this type of networks. And so as you're going to see as I talk later on, the telephone company is very busily trying to do some things to change the structure of their network and get it over to an entirely data-based network. They want their network to be IP-based and all IP traffic, and that's kind of their goal and where they're pushing everything and everybody. And most of that's happening in the wireless front because the rest of the world is going there quickly, and it's kind of accelerating what's happening with us. If you've never really stopped to look, that's on the right there is what a cell tower looks like. Up on the top there, you'll have typically 3 sets of antennas. So the cell will actually get divided into 3 quadrants. So they have, a group of people over here, a group of people over there, and a group of people over there, all served off in one tower. It's quite often then they'll put up 2 or 3 or 4 different sets of antennas and have 2 or 3 or 4 different frequencies operating at once. So some of these towers in crowded areas can get pretty busy. You'll look up there and see an awful lot of antennas, especially while they're in the process of making some of the changes that they are to the newer technologies. Yes, question?
Is that only AT&T or one Verizon, or can you have both on one tower?
It depends. There are people who operate towers commercially, and then they will lease space to whoever needs it. And so that's a very popular thing to do, to say, well, Verizon needs them. Well, sure, I got space in my tower. AT&T, yeah. Many times the companies own their own towers, in which case it would only be their own facilities. But you really can't tell just by looking. Sometimes it does get switched up. Lots of warnings on there. Of course, there's lots of RF stuff inside. Now, this is the mystery of what's in there. Cabinets full of equipment and coax cables going up to those antennas there. But inside of the little sheds that are at the foot of the towers are just lots and lots of equipment cabled back to and tied into the telephone network. So just kind of go back through the history of how wireless communications has evolved is also kind of interesting to understand what's happening. Back when cellular technology was introduced back in the 80s, it was what became referred to as first generation or 1G network. And surprise, surprise, you didn't have much data capacity back then, but you could use it to make telephone calls, which seems a little surprising today because that's kind of an afterthought for smartphones. But that was what the first generation cellular network was all about, was making phone calls while you drove around. Back in about 10 years after that, in the 90s, the second generation of the network evolved, and this is where they switched over and tried to take the data off from this voice network and to get that traffic separated, and introduced a separate data component. So while you still had that one radio link, when the information got to the tower, they split phone calls and voice messages one way, and data went another. So they installed another bunch of equipment in that little shack in there, and separated the voice calls from the data calls, and started to separate the data from the voice. And this happened in the 90s because even back then, in the world of telephony, they had a vision for where they wanted this to go, and they knew they had to have a data network. So this was the beginning of starting to put the components that they had to have in there so they could start doing all the fancy data stuff later on. With the digital technology, there was many different standards that emerged that you could use to basically communicate from the tower to the cell phone, something called a protocol. And there were two very common ones that kind of became commonly used in the United States, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But that was the CDMA and the GSM are just two different protocols, two different ways of handling the traffic between the phone and the tower, two different ways of encoding all the stuff that became very popular in the United States. Now, with the second generation stuff, because it was data, you could do lots of interesting things. Well, actually you couldn't. You could download ringtones, and that was about all that you could do to play with your phone. It did also introduce something called short messaging service, SMS, and so this is kind of like Twitter a little bit. It's very short messages, 160 characters, but the ability to do this was built into that protocol that allowed the phones to have this ability to send these text messages. But it's not messaging like we think of it today. This was nothing but text, numbers and letters. You couldn't attach pictures or videos or anything like that, so it was pretty primitive for its day. But that's still a part of the network today. It's evolved and it's grown much beyond that. But this basic SMS capability is still there and is something you can still do today. The telephone company loves acronyms, and so they came up with something called EDGE, the Enhanced Data Rates for GSM Evolution, and that was just an attempt to, it wasn't an attempt, it was an architecture where they said, okay, this is how we're going to keep modifying and changing the network and changing the protocols to give more and more capability to the phones to start doing things better, more interesting things, stuff they could sell to consumers and make more money and to make the phones more useful. And so along with that, that was one of the first things that happened that bumped our data speeds up. So now we could push more data over that wireless link because it was happening a little bit quicker than it had been up until then. Right around 1999, we came up with the third generation of stuff. So again, this was a big step forward, more equipment, modifications to the protocol, so it improved the data rate so they could have even higher speed stuff. And with this, it was when it became possible to start having things like personal digital assistants and smartphones. And those emerged because the network at this point was capable of doing some of this interesting digital stuff. It was also about this time, just to show you how long this stuff takes, about 15 years ago, that the industry got together and said, okay, we really want to refine this roadmap for where we want to be and how the technology is going to work and how all these things we take for granted today are going to happen. And that was termed the long-term evolution of the network, or abbreviated down to LTE. It's a term that is in vogue and used a lot right now. But this all was solidified and was pretty much in place right around 2000. I took a couple of classes on cellular technology in my master's program, and they were just talking about LTE at that time and how cool it was going to be. And here, 15 years later, we're finally seeing it. It is tremendously difficult to do. It takes a heck of a lot of equipment and a lot of money, and it's taken a while. But in 15 years, we're there, and we're starting to see the benefits of this. Around 2005, there were some further enhancements to this. Some carriers incorrectly branded this something as a fourth generation, but it really truly wasn't. It was kind of just an enhancement to the 3G stuff. And at this time, things were starting to fragment in the standards industry. There wasn't any real one way the industry is doing it, because by now there was enough carriers and enough equipment manufacturers that people were kind of starting to go their own way. But it did speed up the network considerably. This is about the time that Apple introduced the iPhone, 2007, and the Android came out in 2008. Again, taking advantage of the faster data throughput and the ability to do things quicker and better than it had been before. Which finally brings us to today. So sorry to drag you through the dusty roads of the history, but it kind of, I think, helps you understand when we talk about a fourth generation network, to understand we've been through many iterations. And so what the carriers are implementing today is referred to by many things, but I think the most consistent term I've heard is something called 4G LTE. It's the fourth generation, the implementation of this long-term evolution plan that's been in the works for the last 15 years. And the big thing this is providing from the carrier's perspective is it's native internet protocol, this networking that we all have running through cables everywhere. Well, now that IP protocol is now natively running over that wireless link, and it's making these phones have a data connection and work more like a computer and less like a telephone. And with that, many things become possible. But they're not quite happening quite yet. Even though this capability is there, the carriers are just in the process of implementing this and making it work. So for today, for the most part, your phones are still kind of running over the old way. Those old voice circuits and the voice things that have been in place since there's been a cellular network. For the most part, those are still being used, but the data stuff is being put in place. The carriers are working to get all of the kinks out of the standards and to make it all work. And their intention is to evolve over totally into this pure digital fourth generation LTE database network and rep all of that other stuff out eventually. So for now, they're kind of having two networks. And the data is the new one, and that's where they're going. And eventually, it's going to be purely data, and all the older stuff that we've been using up until now is going to be gone. Hopefully, we're not going to notice any difference, because it should still work. But here's the reason for all the fuss. Up until today, and even kind of today, if you're talking on your cell phone, you have basically one channel through that radio network where all your data is going. You have a second channel, still over the same radio link. They're kind of bundled together. But when it gets to the cell tower, it gets separated and it all goes to the voice network. So we still have this segregated world where your voice goes this way, your data goes that way. And that's what they want to eliminate. They eventually want to have it so that the voice stuff is gone and there's just nothing but a data link, and everything that you are doing on your phone that's communicating, be it your voice, listening to music, watching TV or whatever, is all going over as data on that data link and coming into the carrier's internet network, and then doing, you're going to and whatever it is you want to do. And that is their goal, and where they've been driving for the last 15, 20 years, is to get the wireless stuff so that it is all data-based and not this voice stuff based like it was. And that's kind of where we are today. Like I said, they're implementing this putting the voice stuff over the data and trying to make it work. Now, one of the reasons why it's complicated is because, remember our handoffs, as you're driving around, you have to be able to switch from tower to tower. And one of the things that's giving them fits is as you're going from this data voice over LTE mode back over to the old 3G. The transition because this has to happen very quickly, and the transition as you're driving between cell towers and trying to switch from a voice over LTE based thing back over to the old stuff is causing them some problems. And so Verizon's been kind of on the forefront of this. I've been reading a lot about some of the issues they're having, and it's just taking a while to get all the stuff worked out, but they will. And plus they're kind of straddling both networks. Eventually when it's all data, it's all going to happen a little bit better, but for right now, people who have phones and are in parts of the country where they're using this voice over LTE stuff to carry live traffic are bumping into some problems. And so, like my nephew just bought a new phone. They have a cabin up in northern Wisconsin. He's got his new phone. Ought to work better, right? Well, he gets up to his cabin, he can't make a phone call anymore. And it's because Verizon's got the voice over LTE turn on up there, and that network isn't as ubiquitous and isn't quite as strong of a signal. But and I told him about this next time he goes up. I've read in other parts of the country where you can go into your phone and say, okay, I'm just going to turn off the voice over LTE capability on the phone, make it kind of a dumber phone, switch it back over to the 3G stuff, and it works just fine. So for the transition, that's some of the things that people that have the phones that have the capability are kind of having to do just to keep from having their stuff get dropped on them quite so much. But again, it's new technology. It's proven in the lab. It's just the real world is always a little more difficult than the labs are. They will get the kinks out of it, and it will be pretty cool stuff once it gets all working. Some of the stuff that it will do for us, because they have a little more bandwidth to work with, the audio quality on our calls ought to improve a little bit. If you've had trouble communicating with people over a cell phone because it just doesn't sound so good, well, that's because they're really trying to cut down as much of the data as they can to squeeze as many calls in that wireless link as they possibly can. And it had an impact on some of the quality of the audio. With digital, it should be possible for a differentiating service that the carriers can offer would be kind of a high definition audio experience, and have people sound like people again and not like Donald Duck. The other thing they're still working out is it's bad enough within your own network, but between like Verizon and AT&T, as you are transiting out of AT&T territory over into Verizon, they're still working out the kinks of just exactly how they're going to exchange this data, bill each other for it, and all that stuff. So those are a couple of things that are just kind of pending in the LTE front. So that's kind of where we've come from and where we're going. It's also useful to understand a little bit about some of the technology, because those of you that are going to be buying cell phones or are thinking about, a couple of you I've exchanged some email with, they've told me they're really interested in hearing this because they're thinking about buying a phone. This stuff kind of has an impact on what you may or may not buy. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the technology and some of the stuff kind of behind the phone so that you can understand that. So the phones operate over radio spectrum, they're radios. That spectrum is licensed. You can't just say, well, I want to be a cellular company and start broadcasting signals, because the spectrum is a very valuable commodity. And the cellular companies spend millions of dollars in auctions buying this stuff from the FCC. And so it's not something that just anybody can grab and start using. And because of this, there's just some things that you understand. In particular, the fact there's about 7 or 8 different frequency bands that are available around the country for use to actually send out the radio frequency signals to the phone. They become available at different periods of time. Probably recall several years ago when we all had to buy little converters or buy new televisions because our old television stuff didn't work anymore. Well, that was because the FCC had promised that spectrum, or the availability of that spectrum, to the wireless industry for years. And they finally said, okay, time's up. Everybody has to get off the analog stuff because we're taking that spectrum, grabbing it back, and then they sold it for a lot of money to all the carriers who wanted to have more spectrum for all the stuff we're talking about here. So these different frequency bands have become available to different companies at different periods of time. This is kind of the laundry list of what frequencies different companies could possibly be working on. But if you go into one area like Dallas, you'd find AT&T is using one set of frequencies there. Verizon's using some different ones. You go to Chicago, it's a different mix. You go to Seattle, it's completely different. It just kind of depends on what was available to that wireless carrier at the time they bought their spectrum, or when they bought other companies that own the right to the spectrum, so it's kind of a mishmash. And the situation in Europe is somewhat similar. So it just is, the only reason I mention this is that it's something to consider and something to take into account when you're either traveling with an existing cell phone, if you want to go, say, to Europe and use your phone there, or if you're thinking about buying a phone, you want to take into account a little bit of some of this so that you can buy a phone with the, that has all of the capability and can handle all of the spectrums that you might encounter in your travels with that phone. So some of your older phones, you might go to a part of the country or you might go to a part of the world where it just simply cannot work because perhaps in that part of the world they're using a frequency spectrum that that phone doesn't operate on.
How would you know that?
Well, how would you know that? You would have to do a little bit of research. And so if you're, say going to England, you can go to your carrier's website and they will have some information about, okay, this phone should work in England or it should work in Italy or it won't work in these countries. You have to do a little bit of homework ahead of time to be sure that when you get there, the thing is going to work the way that you want. You can, of course, you can call them too and say, I'm a Verizon customer, here's the phone I have, I'm going to wherever you're thinking about going, is this going to work? And they will work with you to help you figure that out. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. The other thing I had mentioned earlier is that there's a couple of primary protocols that in this country we settled on. And again, the protocol is just what defines how the phone and the cell tower are communicating. It's kind of like the language. You can kind of think of one language being German, one language being French. You can still communicate fine. There's one's not any better than the other one, but they are different. And one, it turns out, is a little better than the other. So there's two major technologies in use in North America, the CDMA and GSM. Let's talk about those just a little bit. Okay, CDMA is an acronym, of course. It stands for Code Division Multiple Access. And it is what's used by Sprint and Verizon. And it's popular in a couple of other parts in the world, so if you're a Verizon customer and you're going to Russia or parts of Asia, you may be in luck, because that's kind of the pockets of where this technology has been used. But that's about it. The rest of the world is using something called GSM, which stands for Global Systems for Mobile. And this was the standard that got a lot of acceptance primarily in Europe and most of the rest of the world, in fact. And AT&T made a smart decision about 10 years ago. They were actually on a different protocol, and they made the decision at that time to say, you know what, the rest of the world's going to GSM. They completely converted the network over. They redid all of their transceivers and put in the GSM, and it's set them up pretty well because, and us, for any consumers that have AT&T phones, because a GSM phone works well in this country and works in most of the rest of the world. And so, that's the only consequence of one protocol over the other. Again, they both work fine, they both carry calls, they both have all the same data capabilities, but GSM is just more widely deployed, and so the phones that are made to work in a GSM network have a much larger base of consumers, and as a result, there's just a lot more technological innovation, and it's more likely when you travel, if you have a GSM phone, that phone's going to work in other parts of the world. CDMA, not so much. So in thinking about kind of the major characteristics of how a phone works and where it's going to work, you've got the frequency band or bands that it's working on. That's one thing that you have to consider. And then what protocol it's using. Is it a GSM or a CDMA? And those are kind of the big decisions that you need to make in deciding what kind of a phone you're going to buy and take into account where you might want to use it if you're planning on traveling or something.
Is there a way you could know that except for them telling you?
No, because it's really not something that most people know. But again, now you know that Verizon is not a GSM provider; they're a CDMA, and AT&T is. So, if having a phone that you can use around the world is very important to you, and you're planning, say, travel to Europe a lot or other parts of the world that are on the GSM network, that might be a reason to lean towards AT&T. Again, in my family, I've got a lot of people that live up in northern Wisconsin in an area served by Verizon. When I get up there, my AT&T phone's useless. So if I was going to be spending a lot of time up there, I'm lucky here in Dallas we have great coverage by Verizon and AT&T. I might be tempted to buy a Verizon phone knowing that I'm going to spend a lot of time up there because it works. So I mean, how do you know this right now? It's difficult. You just have to kind of be aware and talk to other people and see, what their experiences are and what they're using in the different parts of the country or the world. But that's kind of what I've covered in this slide here, is just that practically there's no difference. Functionally, if you're traveling to a part of the world or a part of the country where it makes a difference, then you might want to be aware of that and steer yourself one way or the other. And again, that's true in choosing a provider. AT&T might be a better choice for some people. Verizon might be for another. They're both pretty good companies. I've sprinkled a lot of references, and those of you that weren't here last month, don't go blind trying to read that link. If I get it real small like that and get it on one line, if you go to the PDF version of this presentation I have on the website, you can just click on it and follow that link. So don't even try to read it. But I'm going to refer a number of pretty good articles I found, and this one was one talking about comparing different providers and giving you a little more information than I'm able to do in a few slides here about which way you might want to go. Now, choosing a phone gets interesting too. We're called smartphones, but most of the things that they do don't have anything to do with being a phone. And so there's an awful lot of other things that they do that are probably going to sway you and say, well, I like this one over that one. The big difference is the operating system. And so, the Android operating system and Apple's iOS have about 96% of the market. Microsoft is struggling mightily to get the Microsoft operating system accepted, and then everybody else is kind of down in the weeds there. But even at that, Android has the overwhelming share of the market even. They've got about 85 or 86% of the cell phone market. Now, it's an operating system that was created by Google, and so it's freeware. That's why a lot of companies like to use it. It's used all around the world. Like I said, about 84% of the smartphones in existence use it. It's a fine operating system. The only downside to it is that because it is freeware, manufacturers have access to the code and can diddle with it and tweak it to do what they want. Hackers have pretty good access to it as well. And so most of what's going on in the malicious software arena right now is happening to Android phones because there's more of them and because the software is so freely available for people to get and to study. And so with the Androids, you just have to be a little more cautious about downloading software and following links and things, because you're far more likely to have malicious things writing in some of the emails and the websites that you visit and cause problems for you. But iOS people, Apple people, don't have much of a reason to be smug anymore. Right, David? We just talking before tonight that we had somebody had their iPhone hacked last week. And so that's becoming more and more predominant. And the reason for that is because the iOS market share, although the percentage of the phones that it actually covers is decreasing a bit, it represents a lot of purchasing power. And let me just kind of underscore this point. There's some research that I was looking at that iOS devices dominated online Christmas sales this year. So I won't bore you by reading too much, but 57% of the online shopping using a mobile phone was from an iOS operating system. And the amount of average charge was about 50% higher for iOS purchases. And then there's something called Apple Pay, which we'll talk about in just a minute. All of these things are making people who have iOS phones become very desirable to hackers because they're people spending a lot of money online, and that's where the hackers want to get their hooks in. And so it's making the iOS operating system a more attractive, more desirable target for people to do malicious stuff too. So even though Apple has been kind of shielded from some of the bad stuff that's been happening in the malicious software arena, people are catching up. So we talked last time about security. We'll touch on it again. It is starting to become more important that you have some anti-malware stuff even on your phone, not just on your desktop or your laptop computer. Apple Pay is kind of interesting. It just came out late last year, and it's a kind of a way to do automatic payment. So what you do is you basically register your credit card with your phone, and in the process of doing that, at the time that you register it, you kind of sync up with your credit card provider as well. And so they basically have a link to your, or they understand what credit cards you have on your phone. Now you've got it on your phone, you go up to a point of sale like a store or someplace, I don't think McDonald's is doing it, but they could, where you buy something, you just take your phone out, hold it up by a little sensor, the sensor communicates with your phone, it doesn't get your credit card number, but it gets this kind of like a one-time code, and it says, oh, okay, well that's like a Visa, it sends a thing over to Visa and says, well, is this valid? Visa says, yep, that's valid. And then through that kind of one-time code that identifies uniquely you and your credit card number, they make the charges happen. You know, you walk away with your Big Mac or whatever. So, I mean, it sounds complicated in the way it is, but what they've done is they've eliminated the need for you to actually physically get your credit card out. You don't ever, with the vendor, ever actually give them your credit card number. You just simply authenticate physically with your phone and say, you know, make it happen that way. And they swear that they've got this all very secure and very tightly locked down so that it can't be hacked. We'll see about that. But the idea is that it is a way to kind of shield your credit cards and your credit card numbers from being exposed at that point of sale, which is where things are pretty vulnerable. You know, about all anybody could get with this technique would be that one-time number, and with that, it's really kind of useless. The way a lot of hacking things have happened is stores have had all of our credit information on computers that hackers have been able to get into, and they'll go in and steal the whole database, and now they've got your credit card number and your identity, and they're off to the races. They can just use, you know, that information and make charges out the yin-yang. With this, that's going to be a lot harder to do. So, Gene, you have a question?
So if someone steals your cell phone, if that,
You're in trouble.
after that one use, then for that, whatever that code is that you bought, say something at Macy's, then a thief could not use your cell phone?
Well, no.
Let your cell phone lock, but you can't get to it.
Right. If somebody gets your cell phone, you know, then they just kind of wave it in there. I mean, it's like, you know, it'd be like having your credit card. But if they have your cell phone and you have Apple Pay on it, then they're off to the races again. But you know what? The only phone that Apple has done this on is a 6, which has the ability to have the thumbprint read, and so plus it is fairly easy to lock your phone if it gets stolen. So if you do lose it, it's pretty easy to shut that down. But again, there's no piece of information that they could get out of that transaction and then use to run your credit card up or drain your bank account down. That one-time transaction stuff doesn't reveal any information that anybody could use at any point. But yeah, if they physically have your phone, that's a different story.
Okay, if you've never used it before for that, could they still use it? Or would you have had to have used it that way?
Well, to use Apple Pay, there's a couple things you have to do. You have to, you know, put in your credit card number. It has to authenticate, and it all has to get set up ahead of time. If you never do that, you don't have anything to worry about. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anyway, I'm not here extolling Apple. I'm not an Apple employee, but it is, you know, yet another thing that is attractive to a lot of people and is going to make it that much easier just to, you know, flip out your phone, pay for your purchases. More reasons to make the iOS more desirable for hackers. Is Barbara had a question?
Well, not much, but I don't know about other apps, but Starbucks has had an app for a long time that you can lay your little phone in front of every little scanner thing and pay for your coffee.
Is it a Bluetooth-based thing, a Wi-Fi-based thing?
It's an app.
Right. But how does it communicate with?
They have some kind of device sitting there with a little kind of reddish light, and you hold that phone in front of that little device, and
It scans it.
Okay.
a scanner, and it reads your phone, and you have to have your app turned on.
Right.
I mean, you know, and it will charge your app. Now, you've got to have money, obviously, in your account.
Right.
To do that. It just takes the place, if you got a gold card for Apple, it just takes the place, you don't pull your gold card out, you just put your little phone up there.
Okay. I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, they've had that, I don't know, 2 or 3 years I've had mine.
Okay.
They also have there's another app that's been on my phone for a while that you can, I don't know what it's called, but you can put, like credit cards in or something. I never did use it.
Oh yeah, they had an older one before that. Now, the one thing Apple is touting about this is that they say this stuff is very securely encrypted and locked and only on your phone. It's not up in a database anyplace else. It is physically stored on your phone and encrypted.
Passbook.
Yeah.
This thing called passbook, which I never put anything.
Yeah, I had never used that either. This is, now supposedly better than Passbook.
Yeah, I never used it, but you put credit cards in there or something supposedly it will.
So anyway, if nothing else, it just shows a couple of things, and not the least of which is how integrated these things are becoming in our lives. Yes, question in the back.
Tony, I think Apple has made the selling point that for Apple Pay, they have no direct involvement in the assignment of these codes. Does that mean the bank is totally in charge of those codes?
I would think,
One-time use codes?
I think it's got to be, there has to be something on the phone,
People recognize
yeah.
it going both ways.
Yeah, but I think part of the claim is that nobody now actually knows the credit card number anymore. Once it's kind of registered and sunk up, you're not transmitting that information. It is this other supposedly secure thing that says, hey, you know what credit card number to charge. Go ahead and charge that credit card, but I'm not going to tell you because you know what it is already.
But a bank with these assignable codes could be valuable too to the wrong parties.
I would think so. I don't know the innards of the technology. They say that they have worked this out so that it wouldn't be predictable. It wouldn't be just as easy as saying, at least I don't think, from the little bit I understand about it, I don't think you just have this whole list to say, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh yeah, okay, fine. It's a little more complicated than that. How, I don't know.
Probably a random one.
Well, it can't be too random because they have to know, they have to know it's you and know what card to charge. So, I don't know much about the innards of it. I just know that, in fact, I haven't found anybody that accepts this yet either, so I'm still kind of frustrated. I've got it set up. I haven't been able to use it. Oh, and it just, it was a big hit. November last year, it already accounted for 1% of all digital transactions. I've not seen anything for December or January, but it was introduced like the last week in October, and 1% of all digital transactions, I don't know exactly what that number is, but I think it's a lot of money. So it caught on pretty quickly, considering how few phones there are. Now, have any of you been through the joy of trying to unlock a phone?
My daughter does.
Okay. So when you when you acquire a phone, however you acquire it, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, typically they're locked. So if you go to AT&T and say, well, I'd like to have a phone, they'll say, well, fine, here's your phone, but you're kind of locked onto their network for some period of time. And if you did want to use it on another network, or if you wanted to sell that phone to somebody else, you're kind of trapped. And they do this because part of the mechanism that they had for selling these phones was they basically said, okay, you're effectively going to kind of lease it from us, and you agree to lease it for 2 years. And that's kind of your term of commitment. And after the 2 years, the phone's yours. But between now and then, you're ours. You can't take this phone and sell it to anybody else. You can't take it to another provider. You are locked in on our network. So it is possible to unlock phones, and if you've met your financial obligation, then you can do it. And so we touched on this a little bit earlier, that you can use these phones in other countries. My wife and I went to England in November, and we took our iPhone 4, which is an older one. We just replaced them, but we owned it, so we unlocked it. We bought another SIM with a European provider, and we had a local phone over there, and that was really pretty cool. But we had to unlock it. We had to go through all that stuff and figure it out. It did mean we had another phone number. We actually had a British telephone number, but that was what we wanted, so that worked out pretty well for us. But if you unlock your phone, you have the ability to use it with another network, other countries, or you can even sell it to somebody else and let them use it, but you have to be the one to unlock it. So how do you get a phone that's unlocked? Well, you can just purchase a phone, and you can, nowadays they're changing the model for buying phones. You can actually just buy the phone outright, pay a lot of money, no obligations, it's yours, and that phone will be unlocked. And so you could turn right around and sell it to somebody else, take it to another carrier. It's yours to do with what you want. If you bought the phone with some kind of a commitment, though, you're going to have to wait until you've fulfilled the 24 months or 30 months or whatever you signed up for, or pay a hefty penalty. You basically pay off the phone. Then, once that phone is paid off, then you can contact your carrier and say, I would like to unlock this phone. And so they'll do something in the database. At least with my iPhone, what I had to do at that point was just basically power it down, power it back up again, back it up one more time, and it was magically unlocked. So doing it's pretty simple. It took about 2.5 weeks to get AT&T to get everything set up to allow me to do that simple thing. But from that point forward, that phone was unlocked.
You don't have to get another SIM card?
Well, if I want to go with a different carrier, I do. So yeah, the SIM card has the identity. Yes, there's a question behind you.
Yeah, when you donate these phones to, or old phones to these charities, what do they do? I mean, I didn't unblock it for them.
Right, and with those things, I think they must have setups, arrangements with the carriers that allow them, that they will unlock it. Because basically the carriers just have a database that the phone registers with when it turns on, and that's what determines whether it's locked or unlocked. And I'm sure with them they say, well, yeah, since it's a donated phone, we'll unlock it for you. So, there's a couple of ways that you can get it unlocked. If your phone has a SIM card, and if it's working in the GSM network or is capable of working in a GSM network, it will have a SIM card in it. And that's just basically what identifies that particular phone to a particular network provider. So when you sign up with AT&T, they will provide you with the SIM card. You put it in the phone. That's what identifies you as a customer. It identifies your account, your phone number, and all of that stuff. So if you have a phone that has a SIM card and you buy a new one, they'll generally take that SIM card out of the old one, put it in the new one, and your identity goes with it. So yes, a question here.
I want to check is the Apple 6 doesn't have a SIM card.
Yeah, it's a soft SIM.
Yeah.
Well, I take that back. The 6 does, I think.
There's
I think it
one of
does.
The latest ones was my friend went, I'm not going to get one because it didn't have a SIM transfer in it. Well, there is some new phone out, and I thought it was Apple. We just
I think you can buy it without one, but I think if you still now want AT&T or Verizon service, I think you have to get the SIM from that and put it in. That's just a component of the GSM technology. But I will check again
I
too.
think the direction it's going.
Because if you're with Verizon, for example, you don't need a SIM since, well, you're going to have to with LTE, but for today you wouldn't have to have a SIM card because their technology doesn't require it. But I'll go back and look into that. Okay, so you got a phone. What about a plan? So, in the old days, the cellular plans really used to be focused on how much you talked on your phone and how many text messages you sent. And so when you bought a plan, it was very heavily focused on, is it a local plan or is it nationwide? How many minutes do you get to talk each month before you go over your plan? How many text messages can you send before we start billing you for it? And even to a lesser extent, long distance. Remember when we paid for long distance calls? Okay, well now, the phone stuff's pretty much free. They really aren't paying much attention to that. But they're very focused on the data. So the data is where all the money is, and that's where the network is going, and so that's where all of the focus on the cellular plans is. Even for a while, I had an unlimited data plan from AT&T, but if I used more than the average amount of data in an area, they would throttle me back and send me a nasty email and say, you're using too much data. Yeah, they're getting a lot of love for that one. And plus, they also locked me in and said, okay, you have unlimited data, but you can't add any features to your phone ever unless you drop the unlimited data plan. Even as an employee, they didn't treat me that nice. But data is really the focus. That's where all of the money is, and that's what they're really focusing on. So now, for the most part, when you buy a plan, it's a fixed data amount. So you'll buy a 2 gig or a 4 gig or a 10 gig data plan, and if you use more than that, you'll pay more. Along with that, the text messaging, the 160 character stuff you can do, they could care less whether you do that. Voice service is usually either free or very low cost. And of course, they're very happy to bundle your services. So they'll give you a better deal if you say, well, I'll give you my wireless service and my used to be cable TV and my home phone service and maybe my alarm service, bundle these things together and they'll give you discounts on it. So it's getting kind of complicated. It's kind of like buying a car anymore. Do you want the tinted windows? Do you want the sign? And then, of course, there's family plans. So if you have people that you want to share stuff with, you can share the text minutes. So it really is getting a little more complicated to figure out what it is that you want. But the good news is that there's a little more competition out there. I don't know if you've read that Google wants to become a wireless service provider, kind of. They're not going to do the physical stuff. They're not going to put the towers up and do all that. They're going to rent that from either from Mobile or Sprint. But they want to be able to start offering wireless plans and sell it to the rest of us, so that's all good. There are some price wars going on. Verizon and AT&T are reacting to a lot of what Sprint is doing, and so it seems like every couple of weeks, every month, one of them is announcing that they're doing something that's a little bit better for us as consumers. And you don't have to go with the big guys either. If, again, depending on what your usage is, there are other cellular providers besides AT&T and Verizon, although you may not believe it, but there's a lot of them out there. And some of these smaller companies can offer some very good plans for you, again, if it fits your needs. Coverage and other things have to be taken into account there. But these are 3 different articles that, particularly that last one, How to Save Money in Your Cell Phone Plan, talks a bit about some of the other carriers and some of the things that you might want to do when you're looking for your next carrier. There's a huge change going on, though, in how you pay for your smartphone. Because it used to be you went and said, okay, well, I want that phone, and I'll sign up for 2 years, and you walked out. Well, that's changing a lot. Even though at the end of the time you did own that phone, either if you had an older phone, it'd be free. If it was a newer phone, you'd pay something up front. But both Verizon and AT&T are backing away from this as quickly as they can and going to a completely different model where basically you buy it. And it's a lot like buying a car or anything else. What they want you to do now is either buy the phone outright or they'll finance it for you at 0%. So, and I'll show you the math on that for a second. So either way, they want you to buy the phone, and then they're offering some sweeteners in the data plan to make this kind of attractive for you. And so again, it's made buying phones kind of complicated. In these plans, you're restricted from replacing the phone for some period of time. They will lock you into that extent, but after that time, you're free. And as I mentioned, they'll play with your service charge to kind of make it attractive for you. So for example, here's something off the AT&T webpage where they're comparing on the right what I'll call the old way of buying the phone. You paid them $239 plus tax, commit to a 2-year service, and you'll pay a little bit more for what AT&T calls a smartphone access charge. You'll pay $40 a month instead of $15. And for $140 a month, you've got the phone. Now this comparison I was doing was an Apple 6 with 16 gig of memory. Okay? On the other side, you could basically buy the phone and pay it on the installment plan. So you'd pay $21.67 a month for 30 months. You will pay some sales tax on that. And then your smartphone access charge is a bit less. So you can see for slightly less than $140, you can get the same phone with no money out of pocket. And of course, you always have the option of just buying the phone outright as well. I think I did that. Okay, so here I did kind of the 3 things. On the left now, you buy the phone, cost you $660. You're going to pay a sales tax one way or the other. In the left-hand column, you've got no monthly payments. You've got your access charges, payment for your data plan, and so I did this over a 30-month period, so it's costing you about $1,900 over 30 months to buy the phone and use it with a 1 gig data plan. If you want to do it where they finance it for you, they'll cheerfully do that. You don't have the upfront. You still pay the sales tax. You now have a monthly fee, same data rates, almost an identical amount of money for the phone over a 30-month period. And it's actually more expensive to go the way that we always have. I'll give you $200 and a 2-year commitment, but because of a little bit extra on the access charges, it actually over 30 months costs you about $100 more to buy it that way. So, $100 over 30 months isn't much of a difference, but they want you to buy the phone and kind of just be in the financing business rather than in the phone leasing business. Seems to be the direction that they're going.
How is that an advantage to me? I didn't understand that when I got my phone, because my monthly thing was quite a bit cheaper if I didn't pay for the phone, if I paid it monthly.
I don't understand why it is to them, but it clearly is. There must be something about, I don't know. It's big business. It's a mystery to me. The one thing to watch out for this is that, like with this next 24 plan, I can replace the phone after 24 months. They would let me, now buy the iPhone 8 or whatever. But you notice my payments are spread out over 30 months. So in 24 months, I've still got 6 months more worth of payments to go, even though AT&T says, well, fine, you want to get another phone, no problem. Keep sending us $21 a month for the next 6 months. So they have these next 24, and there's a next 18 and a next 12, but they're all, longer terms of payments. The 12 and the 24 that they're talking about is when you can replace the phone. So it's a little bit deceptive, because it kind of makes you think you're free to replace the phone after 24 months, which you are, but you've got a few more payments to go. That's why I say it's starting to get complicated to buy phones. it's really hard to figure out. Yeah, question in the back?
If you move from a 5 to a 6, does that unlimited data grandfathering stay with you?
As long as you don't change any of your services, it did. But like the one thing I really wanted is I wanted to have a Wi-Fi hotspot turned on. And they said, well, yeah, we'll turn it on, but you lose your unlimited data. If I just kept all the services like I had from the 5 to the 6, they would have grandfathered me. So change phone, yes. Change any aspect of your service, no. You're off mid.
Tony, recently I got a message saying I was going over my text message limit. Because I have a really old plan, unlimited plan. And I thought, this is very strange. But I do remember that when I retired, at some point in time, I wasn't doing much text messaging. And I had like 400, and I went down to 200. It's a little cheaper. But all of a sudden, all my friends are sending messages. And anyway, so I went in to AT&T store and said, tell me about this. And so they did, and that's what was going on. I said, well, can I go back up to 400? Well, you can go back to 400 because you'll lose this plan. I said, are the other plans better? No, the plan you got is better, cheaper, the unlimited plan. Just
Except
don't
for the
use
text.
More than 200 text messages a month. Well, so then I discovered iMessaging. If my friends iMessage, that doesn't count against me.
Yeah.
If they use Facebook messaging, that doesn't count. So send out messages to everybody. Don't send me any text messages for the next 5 days.
I'm over my limit.
Till the next month.
Verizon's pretty similar. Again, you can buy the phone outright. They call their plan Edge. We basically have the payments, or you can go with their 2-year plan. Now theirs is a little bit different. Their 2-year plan actually works out to be about $100 cheaper than the other two. So it's just kind of a mox nix. And I did do the comparison just to do the bottom line for 30 months, even though their commitments all end at 24. But depending on which way you buy it, but it's pretty comparable. It was interesting to see that from pretty much an apples to apples comparison. AT&T and Verizon really, at least for this phone at this data plan, were pretty comparable, which I guess really isn't too surprising. If all this is confusing to you, it is. I'm sorry, don't blame me, but this was a pretty good article that goes into this stuff a little bit more. So if you're thinking about buying a phone, I would encourage you to click on that link and try not to read it and get some more information about that. If you are selling or donating your old phone, though, it is a good idea to kind of strip off all of your information out of there. And this article will go through both an Android and an iPhone, kind of step by step, telling you how to get all of your stuff out of there. So again, just follow that link and they'll give you a step-by-step example of what to do there. But the amazing thing about these smartphones, as I said earlier, is that they're so much more than phones. There are so many things that they can do, and it seems like every day somebody's coming up with a new and a really interesting way of using them. So we've already talked about they do messaging, cameras, navigating device. I'm just going to kind of run through this and talk a little bit about some of these things that they do and some of the interesting stuff I learned about it, because they're really interesting. Back to messaging, though, again, originally you had this basic 160-character SMS thing that was kind of built in starting with the 2G network. But when we think about messaging these days, we're probably thinking about something much different than this. But this is part of your voice plan, not really part of your data plan. And it is something that you're capable of doing between phones. So you should be able to send these kinds of messages from any phone to any other phone. And in fact, you can even from email send text messages to a phone as well. And I'll show you how that works in just a minute. But this is, again, very bare bones, very basic, text only, nothing, very dull. But if you have a plan where you have a cap, it can cost you 5 or 10 cents each text that you go over your cap. What most of us think about as messaging, though, is really known as multimedia messaging. And so, when kids are texting these days, this is what they're doing. It extends the SMS standard and allows you to send pictures and videos, and just about anything you can possibly think of can be attached to them. But it's important to understand this is a data service. And so all of that data, all those high-res pictures you're sending, all those videos are eating into your data plan. So, it's fun. It's great to use. But unless you're in some place where you're like on a Wi-Fi connection where you're not paying for the data connection, it can eat into your data plan pretty quickly if you're sending or receiving big files. This was an article that I came across that talked about how to send free text messages from your PC. And in it talks about how to do it from your email client. And both for the Apple and for the Android environment, ways that you can do that, and then talked a bit more about these free SMS sites. So I just would refer you to that article if you're really interested in learning how to do that. But I mentioned earlier that you could send email to somebody and have it show up as a text message. So for example, I could, like my phone number, I won't tell you what my phone number is, but to send it to somebody who's an AT&T subscriber, you just put their 10-digit phone number at text.att.net, and that message will show up as a text message on their phone. And so these are all of the gateways for all of the various providers. So if you know what provider somebody has and they have a smartphone, you can just go in and send them email with a text message and it will show up that way. That's how we finally got the count from the January meeting with Gloria. Finally got through on text. So one of the things they do is they send text messages in a variety of ways. They're pretty sophisticated digital cameras as well. All smartphones have a built-in camera. You can't buy one pretty much anymore with less than 5 megapixels, which is very sufficient for taking some pretty decent pictures. And in fact, when I went to England last year for the first time, I didn't carry my SLR camera. I was happy enough with the pictures we took with my iPhone, which is a pretty big statement for a serious photographer, not to drag their real camera with them. There are some disadvantages. They still, if in a low light situation, the flash on them isn't as good. They don't take its pictures as well in dark situations as a real camera does. You can't put an external flash on there easily. The lens is relatively low quality compared to what you can get, like with a Canon or a Nikon or something. And you don't have that optical zoom. You can't zoom in and get really close like you can with a camera with a real lens. But there's an old saying amongst photographers that the best camera is the one you have with you, and iPhones are everywhere. And so it's really impressive what they can do. And of course, having the camera integrated with your phone with all the connectivity, it's real easy to share pictures too. Upload them to Facebook and Instagram and text them, and so the convenience is just awesome, and the quality of the pictures, all things considered, is really pretty good. They're also very capable film cameras. So there's a film format called 4K, which just means high resolution. It's like 3840 by 2160, so it's a real high resolution digital picture. But there's an app that you can buy for $10 that will let you take these high resolution images and do some pretty impressive stuff. Folks at Sundance thought so because there was an entire movie that was shot using nothing but an iPhone 5S. I think that's kind of interesting. I've not seen the movie Tangerine, but apparently it's pretty well received by the critics, and all from a cell phone. So I just think that's pretty impressive. So let your creativity flow and make movies. The navigation devices, most of them have some kind of a GPS capability built into them as well. Furthermore, that's all integrated in with some of the other things that are happening on the phone as well. So you now have these location-aware things that know where you are and can suggest businesses around you and things like that. They even have the turn-by-turn navigation apps, so you can put in an address. In fact, you can just go to your contact list if you're trying to get someplace. Go to your contacts, go to the address, click on that, say I want to go there, and it starts talking to you and says just how to get there. And a lot less expensive than spending, I'm not even sure what a Garmin or a dedicated GPS costs anymore, because who needs them? I've got one on my phone. Now the disadvantage of this is you have to have cellular service in order for this to work. So if you're in a part of the world or a part of the country where you don't have cellular service, which I found out much to my dismay in a tunnel under a bay in Oslo. It's like, it's not telling me anything. So just keep that in mind. It does eat into your battery life. The screens are a little hard to see. Audio may not be all that audible. And for some phones, and I think this is true for Androids, you can't use it as a phone while you're navigating, because I think it's kind of an either or. The iOS system will let you do several things at once. And you may need to buy a mounting device or talk your spouse into holding it where you can see it. But so it's not quite as good as a built-in one on the dashboard or a dedicated one, but it's pretty darn close. And again, considering you've got it with you all the time, pretty impressive. They've also got some pretty neat wireless access capability. So you've got Wi-Fi built into it. So when you're at home or you're in a place like this where you have Wi-Fi that you can connect to, all of your data is free. You're not paying for any data charges for all the stuff that you're sending and receiving while it's traveling over a Wi-Fi connection. There's also Bluetooth, which is another way to extend the capabilities of your phone. So Bluetooth is just yet another wireless technology that can be used to extend the audio capabilities of your phone so you can hook up external speakers. If you have a car that has a Bluetooth interface, it will just automatically sync up with your phone when you get in the car. And so your navigation stuff, for example, will come out over the car's speakers. If you get a call, you can answer it by pushing the little microphone on your steering wheel. You can play music and stream it to your device all over this Bluetooth connection. You can buy speakers or integrate it. You can buy Apple TV and integrate your phones in with your audio system. So, pretty impressive stuff.
Tell
Yeah.
Another thing you can do is you can use your iPhone to be the clicker for PowerPoint presentations.
Yep.
If you have the right software, you have
Right.
Mac software. I think there's some other apps.
Yeah, through the Bluetooth stuff. So yeah, it can be remote. It can also be a Wi-Fi router. So it can be what's called a personal hotspot. So what's happening there is your phone has the data connection back to the cellular network. It turns right around, turns on its Wi-Fi, and enables other devices to connect to it, and now utilize it as a portable hotspot if you don't have a Wi-Fi connection or if you have a very poor quality one. Now again, that is of course eating into your data plan. There may or may not be a service charge to turn that onto your phone, but once you do have it, it's very nice. But again, anything that is attaching to your device as a Wi-Fi hotspot is using your data plan, and we'll pretty quickly chew that up if you don't keep an eye on that. There is a technology that you may have heard about called Wi-Fi calling, and this is something that T-Mobile and Sprint are touting as something that you can do. And basically what it does is it takes your telephone call and it routes it over the Wi-Fi connection through your router and into their network. Now, there are those that unkindly say that T-Mobile and Sprint have to do this because their coverage is so poor. I'm not one to repeat such gossip, but they are offering this. It does kind of have a bit of a problem, though, and that is if you do have a phone call up over a Wi-Fi connection like that, and you walk out of range of that Wi-Fi router, you get in your car and drive away, chances are the call is going to get dropped because the transition from the Wi-Fi back over to the wireless network isn't real smooth and isn't real worked out. But that may change as something called voice over LTE comes into play and comes into vogue. That may get fixed. But that's something I read about right now. But so far, T-Mobile and Sprint are the only two companies that I've heard about that are offering this. Verizon and AT&T are not yet, and I don't think they're going to. These things are also pretty good audio recorders. So it's got very nice, very sophisticated audio recording capability. So you can use a built-in microphone, or you can plug in an external one. And the length of time you can record is just really limited by how much memory you have on the phone and how many pictures and videos you have on the phone as well. But obviously you will reach some point where you're going to run out of enough memory to store this stuff, but depending on how much stuff you have on the phone and how much memory you bought to begin with, you can record some pretty long things in a pretty high quality recording if you want to. They're of course pretty sophisticated audio playback devices. So anybody that's played with iTunes or has Pandora streaming stuff, they are pretty good at playing back music. And so there's people that just, like I live with my music all the time. I'm a big iTunes guy, and I've got every song I ever bought. Many of my CDs that I've bought are all on my phone. I've got it all with me, and I just love that capability. And so again, pretty amazing for just all these things that these phones can do. If you're not into audiobooks, that's a great way to play them back. Podcasts are an awful lot of fun. If you're taking a long trip someplace, you can just download radio programs or genealogy guys or whatever and listen to it at your convenience. Just pretty awesome capability. We talked a bit about your choices you have and how you can listen to it. And phones have built-in speakers. You can use headphones. You can plug in external speakers, either wired or Bluetooth. And I've mentioned the Bluetooth that you can tie into your car system. And then Apple TV is something you can tie into your home audio system and stream your stuff from your iOS device over to the Apple TV and play your music that way. So lots and lots of choices there. It's even a TV. People are increasingly watching what we used to think of as television on their portable devices. And it's increased quite a bit recently, and it seems to be a huge trend that people are more and more using these devices to watch things from Netflix and other video sources. So the broadcast people are watching this closely because people are more and more watching on portable devices and less on things that we used to call, remember, TVs? Concept, remember, channels? people used to broadcast on channels. That's a term that kids these days don't understand. What's a channel? I mean, oh, what's a source? Okay, that's an outlet. AT&T even took it to another level when we had the championship football game here. They were doing an experiment where they were doing something called LTE broadcast, because at a football game, everybody wants to see the replay, right? And so rather than having everybody just go back to their favorite provider and say, find me that replay, they're just broadcasting it for you. And so if you have a device and you're part of their network, you can just watch the replay that they send to everybody. It's an easier technology to implement because they're basically sending it one time and broadcasting it to many people. And so it's just yet one more example of how the providers are making really, really creative and interesting uses out of the ubiquitousness of these devices and their capabilities. So you can start expect to seeing more of this kind of stuff at things at sporting events, at malls, anytime as you're at a place where there's something that a lot of people might want to see, this type of technology is also becoming more and more prevalent. It's also a pretty capable computer. I mean, really, that's what is making all of this possible, is at its heart, there is a very powerful processor and a bunch of memory in there. What's different about it is that it's all built around taking advantage of all of the different things that the phone is capable of doing. So it's got this wireless connection to the network, it's got the Wi-Fi connections, it's got the Bluetooth, it's got cameras, it's got sound, and the operating systems are all built to take advantage of that and give you apps that do some pretty powerful things. And so there's a lot of them out there. There's more than 1 million apps for whatever type of phone you choose. And there's more coming along every day, and they're just getting more and more creative. I'm just amazed. So these applications are what's known as mobility enhanced. They know where you are. You can tell them where you want to go. And they can interact with you in a variety of ways. They can talk to you. They can show you video. They can put stuff up on the screen. And again, like now on the Apple iPhone 6s, they know who you are. If that's not your thumbprint, you don't get to have access to it. So there's, that makes many things possible, and it is limited only by the ingenuity of the people that are creating these apps. It's phenomenal. Oh yeah, it's a phone too. Remember that? Now, what I didn't realize is that you can merge up to 5 calls on a conference call. And this is true both on the Android and on the iOS system. So you can actually use it as a pretty sophisticated 5-way conference call device. I didn't even realize that.
You know what, Tony, I just had a thought, just with that last slide there. You can use it as a phone too. One of the things that's happened, I've gotten very used to emails and doing different things on my computer, and I literally don't like to talk on the phone much, just to talk.
Right.
But I use my phone for 100 other things.
Yeah, I took a picture of, I just went down to visit my mom down in Florida. She's quite old, 92 and 83. She lives with one sister, and my other 2 sisters from Chicago are down there, and we're having some quality family time. We're all in our devices sitting around the table. Glad we flew all that way. But they do have, like any phone, it's got call waiting and call forwarding features you can hook up. You can do video calls. So, I mean, they're quite sophisticated as phones. We talked a little bit about international travel. If your technology works in the part of the world where you're going, either GSM or CDMA, and your phone is, well, it doesn't even have to be unlocked. You can take your phone to other countries and use it over there. If it's unlocked, you have the option of getting a local SIM and having a local telephone number. But even if it's not unlocked, even if it is locked, you can still use it over there. It's just going to cost you a little bit more. So you're probably going to pay a bit more for each call that you make and receive. Your data plan's probably going to be a little more expensive. You can disable all of that stuff. You can kind of basically put it in the airplane mode and turn off all that stuff that you would pay for. But every time you're in a Wi-Fi area, in whatever country you're in, then bam, you're back in business again as a computer. So I mean, if all else fails, that's just kind of the cheapest and safest way to be able to communicate without spending any money. Leave it in airplane mode and you'll never get a charge. But if you do want to have the ability to make and receive phone calls, most providers will have some kind of variety of plans that you can buy that will lessen the cost, although it's still going to be staggering by what you're used to over here. Maybe like $1 a minute for phone calls. And your data may be kind of expensive, but at least you can use it natively over there. The only problem with that is that it's still a North American phone number, So if you want somebody, like a hotel to call you, they're actually calling the United States and paying the long distance calls, and then you're paying the toll charge, the $1 a minute to talk to them. So it's a little klutzy, but it does work. So this is an article, again, that talks about many of the things that you can do as strategies if you're traveling, and I encourage you to do a little bit of research before you go so that you know what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Because you don't want to learn the hard way and pay, $40 or $50.
One of the things we did, because we were traveling from London to Italy, is that when we got into the train station, first or second place we stopped, we just went and bought an Italian cheap phone with so
Yeah.
many data minutes, because we just needed it just in case we needed to check on a hotel or, schedule a train or whatever. And so we just bought a cheap Italian phone for like €25 and.
Okay, so that's a pretty reasonable cost for that too.
Yeah, and if we needed more minutes, we could, we could go into the store and I could bump up the minutes for more.
It's an easy way to do it.
Yeah, that's a good plan too.
Go in a drugstore and they can upgrade. Give you more minutes.
Put some recorders in it. Unfortunately, we're all having to be a little more concerned about security in these things, particularly as we start putting credit cards and stuff like that in there. And so, if you're getting apps, you want to make sure you're getting it from a legitimate, app source. Not so much a problem with iOS because you only have the App Store and they screen stuff pretty carefully. Over in the Android world, you've got a lot of other choices, so just make sure that you're downloading from a very reputable place. If it starts asking you a lot of questions or asking for access to things, that's probably not a good sign, and I would probably back off from that. And of course, as we talked about last month, just using strong passwords is a good idea. And increasingly, I'm thinking that you really need to have some anti-malware on your phone. It's getting to be that kind of a world anymore, and it's kind of a sad thing. These are some of the same articles or some of the same websites I talked about in the security because they're talking about the same subject, which is security software. The one that seems to work most broadly is this WebRoot Secure Anywhere antivirus because it runs on, at least on iDevices. I don't know if it's available on an Android, but that way you can kind of have something that works on any platform. But again, research and find what's going to work for you. But I think it's time to start considering your iPhone is just as vulnerable as your desktop and your laptop. Any Verizon customers here? Anybody? You a Verizon customer?
I'm not Verizon.
Okay.
For my iPhone, I'm AT&T for my iPhone.
Okay.
Verizon for my landline.
Okay, well, let's
And
just.
I discovered I only have my landline to help me find my iPhone.
I can believe that. Call it and make it ring, huh?
But I can't find it in my house, I call my own.
Just when you lose your wireless landline phone, you're going to be really hurting.
I know.
Well, Verizon's got themselves into a bit of a bind. They've got this thing that they implemented called super cookies, and it's just an identity that they attach to every packet of data that gets sent to and from your phone, and it uniquely identifies you, and they swear it's anonymous. But there have been reports from people that have been able to use this to their advantage and actually break the anonymity and tell who you are. Why does Verizon want to do this? Well, they want to do it because they want to know more about your, basically, the places you're going and the things that you're buying. Not so much you specifically, but you generally, because this information potentially is very valuable to people who want to have advertising and sell services and other location-aware things. So it's kind of what Google does. Google knows everything you do when you Google it and your email and all that. And they're doing that because then when you're searching for something, when you're trying to find a local business, you're trying to find a recommendation, they can kind of zoom in on your interests. They can even, in Google, they can have ads for things that might interest you. And your ads will be different than somebody else's because your interests are. Well, Verizon wants to get into that game too. And so they came up with this and thought, okay, we can start selling this data just like Google is, only for our mobile users. But it hasn't worked out so well for them because, as I've said, there have been several companies that claim to have been able to crack the anonymity and start being able to track you and find out who you are. So until just a couple of days ago, you really didn't have any choice for opting out of this. Verizon said that they would allow you to disable it, and all that meant was we promise we won't use it, but the codes were still there. What they just announced on February 3rd is that they're going to come up with a way to allow you to completely opt out of it, details to be provided later. So I don't know exactly what that means, but they're certainly reacting to the outcry from the security and the privacy people that say, we really don't want you to do that. So if you are a Verizon customer, just kind of keep track of the news, and if you would like to opt out, they're going to be providing the details of just how you can do it and what you're going to go through there. And again, there's been lots of stuff in the press, so several links to articles about what you can do right now and what you can do in the future when they get whatever it is they're going to put in place. This one you can't do anything about, but it's kind of interesting. There are fake cell phone towers around the country. These are kind of in the news. People have identified that they're there. They're not really sure who's operating them. And you may not ever even be aware that your phone is being carried on these things, because they look and act just like real cell phone towers, but they're not. So it's alleged, it's thought that's probably our government NSA type activities going on, but nobody really seems to know for sure. I've also read that when, like up in Ferguson, when you have large groups of people in public unrest and things like that, that the public officials will move in. It's called a COWS, a cell tower on wheels. They'll move those things in and start grabbing your phone calls and either throttle, like Twitter and some of the other instant messaging stuff, or monitor it, if so they can try to get an idea of where's the riot going to break out next. So I just kind of mention this just because it's good to know it's out there. You may or may not ever know that it's happening to you, but Big Brother is sometimes watching. I talked about in the security thing, the story about the frog in the pan of water. It'll sit there if you slowly raise the temperature until it dies from the heat, because it just doesn't notice the change around it. Now the change for us is what we're giving up on our privacy and our security. These things are really great, but they're potentially little transmitters about what you're doing and where you're doing it and all of that as well. So I think it's cool for the most part, but this kind of stuff does kind of make you scratch your head, but I guess it's just the price we pay for the technology and the society we live in. There's a couple of things that you might want to think about doing to kind of keep your phone operating optimally. And so there are some things that this article suggests that you might do to get some more life out of your battery, cutting down on some of the apps that you don't use anymore so you're not using up so much memory, and just simple stuff like cleaning the screen so it's a little bit easier to read. But they are expensive little critters, and so a little care and feeding is a good idea. Chrome users, this is an interesting thing I discovered too. Chrome has a setting in the Chrome browser that allows you to manage your data usage pretty effectively. And so for anything that you're doing when you're in Chrome on a cell phone, you can go in settings, bandwidth, and set your reduced data usage switch on, and it has a way of actually eliminating a lot of things like white space and other junk that doesn't really need to be sent back and forth, to cut down on the amount of data that you're actually transmitting to and from your phone, to reduce the amount of data that you're using up in your data plan. And so I turned it on. It looks pretty impressive. It has a nice little graph showing me how much data I've saved. I guess I believe them, but just something for if you do use Chrome, you might save yourself a few bytes here and there in your data plan. And then just a couple of sites I came across that were really, really good sources of information for both Apple and for the Android users. It's part of the Dummies outfit, but there's just an incredible amount of information. And in getting ready for this, as I was perusing through there, I was just surprised at how much I learned. So if you ever find yourself saying, I wonder if my phone does, or I wonder how I do it with my phone, would encourage you to try these sites, because there's just a wealth of information there. And then I'm going to finish off just talking a bit about net neutrality. And here I'm probably going to let my AT&T roots show again, so forgive me. But a lot of talk in the news. The FCC chairman has just proposed and said that they're going to make some recommendations to ensure that the network is neutral and life is good for us. And I just want to talk a little bit about that, because it's going to have an impact on us one way or another. I mentioned that the move in the wireless network is they want to take and put everything as data. They want your voice digitized. They want all of your music, all your pictures. They all want it as a data stream, because it makes for a very efficient network for them, and it makes it able to do a lot of really cool things. And this has been the direction for the wireless industry for the last 15 or 20 years. They started planning very seriously for today's network 15 years ago, and have spent a lot of money. We'll get to that in just a second. Kind of interesting, in 1985 there was 900 cell towers in the United States. Today there's 190,000 of them. And well, it's not enough, but you know, the average cost for putting a cell tower is pretty high. I figured, industry figures, that was about $28 billion worth of investment to build all those cell towers. That's just the cell towers. So it's very expensive to be in the cellular game. It costs a lot of money. The change doesn't happen very quickly, and so part of the complaining you're hearing from the wireless companies right now is, for Christ's sake, we just spent 20 years building this data network out, and now you're going to change the rules on us, because that's effectively what's happening. AT&T, the latest figures I could see in 2013, they spent more than $20 billion on capital investment. That's, you know, buying stuff to put in the cell towers, laying fiber, doing things like that. Biggest company in the United States. And in AT&T, this is, I think, the third year in a row that they had led the United States in terms of capital investment. Verizon wasn't far behind. They're spending about $15 billion a year. You know, so between these two companies, they've been spending, you know, year after year, $30–40 billion building their network out. You know, AT&T, you know, has great plans for going all digital, and they eventually want to get to the point, they feel within 10 years they're going to be able to say, you know, those old analog landlines that we had, they don't want to sell them anymore. They want the stuff in your home phones to be going over the digital links and all of the traffic going there. They want a completely IP-based network because it's much more cost effective, and again, this is what they've been working for 20 years. And so, you know, they're on the verge of having an all IP network. And, you know, today, the FCC is saying, well, we're a little concerned about, you know, what you might be doing in terms of equal access. So, you know, we're moving back towards regulation again. And so it's just going to be kind of interesting. You know, the industry, the wireless providers and a lot of the AT&Ts and the Verizon see this as a power grab. They're not happy about it. And as I said, they've spent billions of dollars and see a lot of revenue at stake here. So you're going to see a lot of screaming and fighting over this thing. So it's just going to hang on to your hats. I don't know which way it's going to go or what it's going to lead to, but it's going to be some pretty tumultuous times and pretty interesting to see what happens when all the dust settles. But I think this is going to be a years-long fight. I think you're probably going to see it go to the Supreme Court a couple times. But it's just kind of, I think that's the future of the wireless industry right now. It's just going to be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth on both sides over this.
There's been a lot of conversation on NPR regarding this.
May I have your attention, please? The library will close in 30 minutes. Please begin gathering your personal belongings. Library materials must be checked out and computer printouts paid for by 7:45 p.m. Public restrooms will close promptly at 8 p.m.
Okay.
And what I can't get my head around is FCC wants to regulate the internet, but how can they do that when the internet is
Well,
worldwide?
well, they can, and what they want to do. Here's some of the stuff that's going on, and then the concern of the carriers. All of their stuff is data, and it's just like anybody else's data is all going to be running on these pipes, particularly like the wireless link. This is what's really got the industry upset is the wireless links, and so some of the things they want to be able to do is to say, well, okay, one of the games, it's not a game, one of the things they're doing is they'll go to Netflix, you know, a provider, and AT&T will work out a deal with them and say, well, fine, if you're an AT&T customer, you download movies, that doesn't count against your data plan. You know, great selling thing for AT&T customers, right? So, you know, those kinds of deals are happening, and the FCC is saying, well, no, wait a minute, that's getting kind of a cozy relationship, and you're, you know, getting a little too tightly bound in the content there, and they're not really comfortable with that. People that are pushing things like video and audio streams want to be sure that their customers are getting stuff, you know, without having all the interruptions and all the pauses. And so one of the things that a provider can do is they can say, all right, well, fine, for Pandora, make a deal with you. All your content is going to have a little more priority than everything else, so your stuff just comes right through without any of the stops and gaps and stuff. You know, we'll take care of you. That's the kind of stuff that's making the FCC nervous, is because it's you know, allowing the providers to say, well, I'm going to give priority to their traffic, inevitably slowing down your traffic, and that's where you start getting the inequity. And that's part of what the FCC is upset about, and that's their job. I mean, that's a good thing. They're supposed to be looking out for us consumers. I think everybody expected that in the internet. What really shocked the industry was when the FCC said, no, we're going to include that wireless link, and we're going to make sure there's nothing going on there. And that was really a rude shock to the wireless providers because they did not expect it, and it doesn't fit well with their plans and their models. So, you know, that's why there's going to be horrible fights over this stuff because there's a lot of money at stake. Yes, the back.
Is this not likely to lead to so-called private networks that can grow and expand?
Yeah, but you can't have it would be difficult to have a private wireless network, a private cellular network.
But the companies own the equipment, do they not?
Well, yeah.
But can they carve out a certain portion of their equipment for a private network for ExxonMobil or whoever else wants it?
I guess they could. That's not the model that they're building for. Now, where this may go, and I'm no legal expert either, they could carve out and say, okay, AT&T or Verizon, you know, we'll carve out a piece of that wireless channel for your internal network stuff, and what we're really regulating is all that other stuff. But as far as you know, stuff going to and from your devices, maybe that will be exempt from these rules. I don't know. It's crazy right now because nobody really knows where they're going.
Straight line T1 lines so that a particular investment company can get a millisecond edge on their competitor.
Well, landlines are a bit different. It's this kind of publicly shared wireless stuff which is increasingly where it's all at that they're talking about regulating. So,
Those are hardwired. I'm thinking in terms of the analogy.
yeah, the wireless stuff just makes it a little squirrely, and the internet makes it a little squirrely too. And this is a whole new territory, so it's a whole new thing. And like I said, there's a lot of money in here, so nobody's going to be happy when the dust settles. And we're really kind of to the point now where I'm ready to take any questions you might have about anything. This has been a presentation of the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you. Your membership dues are supporting this and other society activities. If you're not yet a member, I hope you consider joining. You can become a member for as little as $35 a year, and you can join by going to our website, dallasgenealogy.org, and clicking on the membership tab.